This week, we welcome to the show author, artist, and musician Gabriel Kennedy to talk to us about the one and only Robert Anton Wilson, his life, his times, his philosophy. So, Gabriel, welcome aboard.
Thank you, Gordon. Thanks for having me here, man.
Yeah. Congratulations on the book, on Chapel Perilous. I believe is it the first biography or just like the biggest biographical project?
I'm happy to say that this is the first biography of Robert Anton Wilson. He passed away in 2007. So, it's been 17 years. And that tends to happen with writers sometimes. They about 10, 15 years, they might be forgotten. And then someone will come along and help remind people how great they were.
See, that's a good place to start, actually, because I would like to know. It's a lot of effort. It's a lot of energy and thought and input and like a chunk of your life that goes into this. So tell me about the first time you encountered the work of Robert Anton Wilson. Do you have a memory of it imprinting on you?
For sure, yeah. It was math class, senior year of high school. A classmate handed me the book, Luminatus Trilogy. I'll show you this book right here. And
I have that exact same one. Carry on.
Yes,
and it looks about the same. It's all beat up.
Yeah, a little dog-eared.
Yeah.
Well worth it. So he handed me that. I was intrigued by the cover, the pyramid and the dolphins and whatnot. And I read the opening quote for the book itself. It was Ishmael Reed, and it was from his book Mumbo Jumbo, I think. And it said the history of the world is the history of warfare between secret societies. And I was completely taken by that, but not mostly too because it was secret societies, plural. Everyone, the common conspiracy theory association with the Illuminati is that it's one kind of continuous sort of society, secret society, if you will. But already the book was promising something more than just a discussion of, one-dimensional breakdown of the idea of the Illuminati. The suggestion that there are many organizations, warring with each other, soft wars, hot wars, all outside of the knowledge of most of the citizens. That's completely fascinating to me, and also the book was it was funny as hell. It was hilarious, and the way that it even opened up was like a pulp detective novel. So I can completely go with that. Become interested in the story immediately because I was, met me at my level, right? Like it literally is like a pulp detective novel. One critic described the book as just like a sort of like a run-on sentence, a story that didn't make sense until it finally made sense at the end, and that's part of the joke, And so I was completely taken by just from the style to what was being discussed, everything about the book, and that was senior year of high school, and
Interesting. See, I would have figured mine was through a friend's slightly older boyfriend, I think. Well, he'd heard about it. I'd bought and read Cosmic Trigger 1 first, because this is interesting. I have a question for later on in the interview, but you started with Illuminatus. I started with Cosmic Trigger.
mm-hmm.
If you were to introduce, which presumably you will, having written a biography of him, if you were to introduce someone to the work of Robert Anton Wilson now, and you had full control over in which order they read things, and you can include your own book in this order, where would you have people start with the work of Robert Anton Wilson? Like what does that look like for you? Do you start Illuminatus? Do you start Cosmic Trigger? What do you think's the right, dare I say, the right way of doing it?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks for asking that. I think that Cosmic Trigger is still a great entry point because even though what he wrote about is dated, it's not all breaking news anymore, because what was so special about that book when it came out in verse so many years after was how much new information was in there. That book was the first book to sort of break a number of stories, was even the first book, according to particle physicist Saul Paul Sarag, to get quantum entanglement right for popular fiction. Excuse me, not fiction, for popular nonfiction. That's a pretty huge statement to make, but that's according to Saul Paul Sarag, who was there, right? For that alone, I think Cosmic Trigger is a classic. I think that's a great place to start. I'm not going to say where everyone should start at, but I think a good place to start is Everything is Under Control.
Interesting. All right.
Yeah. Only because we are in a world that is, conspiracy theories are not an edgy conversation anymore.
This is true.
They've been centered for almost 10 years now, the discussion of conspiracy theories and where that whole, that's a whole rabbit hole of further discussion where government policy in America around the idea of conspiracy theories, where, offices are being set up like offices of disinformation or malinformation.
Yeah.
This weird definition of what is information and disinformation. This completely lies in the realm of talk of conspiracy theory. So Everything is Under Control, followed by The New Inquisition. And The New Inquisition, specifically for Bob's discussion of, he does an uncritical or critical inference test. He puts that in his book, The New Inquisition, which was a book that was sort of attacking a traditional notion of what can be described of as science, scientific discourse, like specifically the Committee for Scientific Investigations of Claims of the Paranormal. That was, I don't want to go too much of a tangent here, but I don't want to get too deep in the weeds, but Bob was basically attacking what he does best, is the things that we take for granted, especially in the realm of science. Like, what do we consider a fact even? He didn't just say do your own research. He provided like truly an alternative map to study the information. And that was what he was putting in The New Inquisition, I believe, when he presented his own uncritical inference test, where he kind of tells the reader, you can look at information through a true or false paradigm, but here's 5 more ways that you can look at it. So, something is in a maybe state. Something is, a strange loop. Something is, and so basically what Bob is doing is giving you a lexicon to speak about like more specific aspects of like what's in front of your face, right? So, he said in that book or in lectures at that time that he wanted his readers to have an understanding of a difference between an assertion and, a claim, right? Or a proposition. And then learning the difference between like a legal proposition or say like a historical or mathematical proposition or scientific proposition. And this might sound like gobbledygook in one sense, but when you really look at it and, seek to look at things this way, I think that you're just going to, seek out more information to want to figure things out.
I follow the logic, right? Because you do get to see him as a serious intellectual of logic, like his Bob Wilson doing Karl Popper. Like, I'm actually doing that. This is how you can test reality for its truthiness. I get it. So, all right. So everything is under control. New Inquisition. It's interesting because I had Cosmic Trigger 1, then Chapel Perilous, your biography of him, because it's very dated. I actually gave it to, I had a producer for about 3 or 4 months this year, and he'd never read it because he's 29. So right. I gave him this book and said, this is very dated, but like a John Cassavetes film, like that's not a problem. Like, just as long as you know that it is a document of its time, it's still a masterpiece. And because this is where you first start to hear about like biological signals from space and the 23 Enigma and all like that really cool Bob Wilson stuff. Then you get to the end of it going, well, shit, what even is reality? And then I would slide your book in because it's like, okay, this is putting it nicely, a complex man who had hits and misses in his life, which we're about to talk about in this episode. here is the context for when you come up against stuff that you might personally find frustrating as you move further through the work of Robert Anton Wilson. Because I think you did a really, really good job of that, like really contextualizing where some of the stuff there's stuff that's dated, there's stuff that's wrong, there's stuff that we bounce off today, and it's not a reason to get rid of Robert Anton Wilson. It's a reason to offer him a respectful context so that people could actually get what he was offering. So I put yours at number 2. I like Everything Is Under Control and the New Inquisition. I hadn't had New Inquisition up so far in my list, but I would certainly put your biography before Cosmic Trigger 2 and 3, for instance, because they require some explanation as to what is going on in his life, which I get in your book.
Thank you, man. Yeah. And let it be known, too, that my list shifts, daily. You know, one day it would be Illuminatus, but today I was just thinking in terms of definitely, what Everything Is Under Control. Like, that's such an accessible book, too, to get into. But so is Chapel Perilous, The Life and Thought Crimes of Robert Anton Wilson. And thank you very much. Thank you very much.
In my head, because I did this, I found Cosmic Trigger 1 in this independent bookstore in Newcastle, Australia, when I was 15 and 16, and being very alternative. And, I had a newsagent that would sell me cigarettes, and I would buy cigarettes and these books and sit in the grandstand of our local Oval and smoke and read. And I thought it's terribly clever. And Robert Anton Wilson blows your mind at any age. But when you're an adolescent, like I had to tell everyone about him, right? So I got very good in my head at like, read this, then read this, then read this. It's always my first thought with Robert Anton Wilson is like, how do I replicate what was good about this experience for me for other people in 2024? So it's top of mind. And that's why when I read your book, I'm like, oh, I see. I learned stuff that allowed me to look with, when I say forgiveness or more understanding, I suppose is better at some of the decisions he made with his life. Leaving a higher needs kid in the United States and moving to Ireland and all this stuff. I'm like, okay, now I'm starting to, there was context there that made him more real and more human. But let's talk about the book. Like, I guess question number 1 is why? Like you found Robert Anton Wilson in high school, skip forward 1 or 2 years, and here you are deciding, how does this book come about?
Yeah. I think it came out of basically, when Bob died, he died in 2007. And for the last 3 years of his life, he was running along with his friend, Lance Boucher, this website called Maybe Logic Academy, which was pretty much one of the first asynchronous remote learning, websites that probably was, existed on the internet, perhaps, right? And colleges today, especially since COVID, they all use pretty much the same template as that, for asynchronous learning. And in 2004, Bob and Lance was the director of the documentary, Maybe Logic, The Lives and Ideas of Robert Anton Wilson. And so I was in Santa Cruz on July 23rd, 2003, to watch the documentary of Robert Anton Wilson. I had made it there from Mexico. I had taken a bus and I arrived in Santa Cruz specifically to see the movie and interview Bob.
Whereabouts did this bus come from, and how long was that bus ride?
So it was a long bus ride. It was it was me and an ex-girlfriend, and we took the bus from San Diego to Veracruz.
Okay.
And I was completely ignorant that it was on the complete far opposite end of Mexico, and where Tijuana was, right? So we left from San Ysidro. Yeah. So anyway, the bus ride up, took the bus back up, and that took many hours. It was pretty fantastic. It was a great view of everything. Mexico is a beautiful country. And I was like, wow, Bob, there's this documentary of Robert Anton Wilson, and he's still alive, and it's going to be amazing. I got to be there. And so I made it up to Santa Cruz. I took a Greyhound bus, stayed at a youth hostel, that it was the strangest youth hostel I'd ever been to in my life. They locked the doors at 10 p.m. and they said that if you're not inside, you can't stay. And then at 10 a.m., every resident at the youth hostel had to leave until 3 p.m. so they could clean the hostel or something. So it's a very strange place. And I was like, well, how am I going to do this? And I met this wild person who was not was like a bit of a criminal, like was not paying for the youth hostel, and he told me how to sneak out of the youth hostel and how to sneak back in. And so I did that to get to see the movie. And then while I was at the end of the movie, Bob spoke. He did a Q&A. I was able to ask a question. And then directly after that, I saw David J. Brown, who I just, I met. I'd recognized him, David J. Brown, writer, and was a good friend with Bob. And I said, hey, could you help me get an interview? I made up a magazine. I was like, oh, I'm writing for a magazine called The Cutting Edge. Can I interview Bob? And he was like, yeah, man, let me, introduce to him. And he gave me his email. And the next day, I received an email from someone named, I think it was like Mark C. at Cruzio or something like that. And that was Bob. And he was like, hey, when could you get to Capitola, And that was on July 24th, 2003. And so, that was all impromptu, Gordon. I was like, I got it. And then I was like, how am I going to interview? What am I going to do? And this was before iPhones, before iPods too. I was listening to like my CD player, my Discman on the bus. But, I ran to Radio Shack and I got a tape recorder and a little microphone, and I made it to Bob's, and I interviewed him in Capitola for a few hours, and it was awesome. He was so awesome. And he was in a wheelchair at the time and, used a walker. And I'd only seen him in a wheelchair. And so he greeted me at the door standing up, but he had a walker, and he walked back to the couch, and he was very unsteady, but he made it. And he told me on the way, he's like, yeah, I do this to keep my legs moving. He's like, and, but sometimes I'll fall in front of people and it'll embarrass everybody. And I was like, oh shit. And he was great. He was like, do you want something to drink? You want some Jameson? You want, what would you like? And I was way too nervous to drink. I wish I had a drink with him. And I just interviewed him there. And that's probably the seeds of the biography, really, when I think about it. Because that's a first interaction, right, with the subject of your biography. And therefore I was lucky enough to actually have an interview with the subject, and so that was a long time. And then as a year later, he started the Maybe Logic Academy, and I was a very active member of that. Took almost all the classes that I could, especially his, and then kind of just he became my favorite writer, really. And I'd spent many years, it was like Bob, Leary, Lilly, John C. Lilly, and Timothy Leary. And I would just spend hours, up at night, just writing out notes by hand from their books, just as something to do sometimes, And because I had it in my mind, I was like, I want to write something about something to do with these guys and Bob, probably most likely at some point. So the seed was kind of always there. And it just crystallized, because at first the book was sort of going to be like a discussion of his ideas, and sort of seeking to contextualize Bob as a scientific philosopher, like you mentioned, Karl Popper and whatnot. And really, he introduced me to Karl Popper. He introduced me to the discussion of quantum entanglement. Science going through high school had just kind of become noise to me.
I think about it so often, like all of these subjects that I hated in high school, they're like, because you were shit at teaching it. Like, it's actually fascinating. What's wrong with you? Music's 100%. Another one. Like this is shit. Why are we anyway, that's a side rant. Carry on.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah. Oh man, chemistry was the worst in high school. Physics was the worst, But reading Wilson and Leary too, those two guys together, it really reignited a deep desire to just want to stay at it and keep, what are they talking about when it comes to quantum physics? I want to know. And it took so many years really of reading Bob, rereading Bob, and then interviewing people and doing my own knowledge on it, of course, to get a bit of a grasp on what all that's about. And so, fast forward, did the Maybe Logic Academy for a few years. Bob passed away in January 2007. And then I just, I went, very slowly, it was in the back of my mind, this book for a number of years until 2016 around. And I started writing the book proper. And then that took a few years.
Was there something like instigating? Like, okay, I guess I might as well do this. Because you said it was version 1 in your head of the book was a commentary on his ideas or thoughts on the ideas of him. And then at some stage it became, no, like I need to tell a biography. Did that happen before you started writing it? Or was that somewhere? Because I'm really interested. You met him briefly. You were part of Maybe Logic. And I want to ask about the research process, because you obviously spoke to some of his kids and all the rest of it, because it's a big deal to shift from, I'm going to do commentary on the philosophy of Robert Anton Wilson, because you can kind of do that yourself. Mm-hmm. When a biography is a different project. A biography is like, I have to turn a dead man into pages so that other people can get a sense of like his soul or his spirit. And that's a different game. Tell me about, I'm the guy that's going to write the Robert Anton Wilson biography, and I'm going to do it fairly and lovingly. And what do you do that day when you put on your big boy pants and head out the door? It's like, right, I'm biographizing someone now. Like, tell me about it.
I like the way you just put all that. Yeah, it's very interesting. The biography itself was just going to be like a spine for, say, that book. But it was a very amorphous book. It didn't get very far, because, I realized I got to read a lot more Karl Popper to start talking about scientific philosophy and stuff,
It's and some of the ideas like the brain circuit ideas are wrong and dated, but it's kind of like, but if you wind back to the 70s, it's a really, really good attempt to describe something that we would describe differently now, like neuroplasticity and all of this. And so a book of Robert Anton Wilson's ideas and impact could be bigger than The Lord of the Rings, because it's like, I have to explain something that's wrong, but I have to explain why actually it's still good. Yeah. And to do that, I have to explain like where the best in class thinking is now. I've thought about this way every time I've tried to explain like the 8 circuits model is wrong, because a machine metaphor for a brain is wrong. But there's actually some stuff in there that's useful. And I've had these thoughts. Anyway, carry on. Sorry to interrupt.
Well, I think that's part of Bob's 100% too. And I think that's part of Bob's value still today is that he, like you said, things are dated, facts are wrong. Some of the math is wrong. There's, he made very radical prognostications about life extension and, how fast it was going to come. By the 1990s, we're all going to be living in, space stations and living till 400 years old, And someone asked him about that one time, and he was like, well, yeah, that's true. I said that, but I was seeking to inspire you guys to want to get there. And this is where Bob's kind of slippery, right? But one could say, okay, well, he's being a visionary there. And so when you're a visionary, you're not bound by, rationality and reason, so to speak, about what's right in front of your face right now. However, this is like I said, what's tricky about Bob, he's seeking to also bring in the general semantics and basically the knowledge of ecosystems into the discussion when that was still new. I think the whole discussion of ecosystems and ecological knowledge, which is what his foundation is based in, but only it was called general semantics, right?
This was my big learning, like the thing I learned a bunch of stuff from your book, but I did not, until I read Chapel Perilous, appreciate just how transformative it was for Robert Anton Wilson to encounter general semantics so young. And you spend a lot of time on that going like, no, this opened up his mind. This is what basically programmed Bob Wilson to be Bob Wilson for the rest of his life. Because obviously he talks about it in all his books, but it didn't, I'm like, oh, that's his thing. That's his thing. And I didn't realize that or appreciate quite how important it was until I got your book. And that for me, like, unlocked a whole bunch of stuff that I still have rattling around in my mind from the last read-throughs of some of the books that are, let's say, at the end of my recommended list.
Right on. Yeah, well, I think that's what's so great is that he discovered general semantics in high school. His mind, like, sort of just developed at a quantum rate, if one is to believe what he wrote in Cosmic Trigger Volume 2, which is where that's the source for Bob's sort of high school education curriculum. So taking him at his word there, I mean, he wrote that he read General Semantics, which is an 800-page, giant book in a weekend, right? Along with a number of other, huge books, from all across different sciences. But, what it was with Bob, though, and like why I would be the biographer and why I stepped up, I guess, is that I did something, I feel he's like a kindred spirit, something deeply resonated, with him and me, my last name is Kennedy, right? Like I learned what the Gaelic spelling of Kennedy was in the back of, one of his books, when he talks about Brian Boru O'Canasia, and I remember my dad telling me stories about Brian Boru O'Canasia and being like, we're related to him. And I was like, get out of here. What are you talking about? Right. And, and that struck a deep chord. And then Bob, he lived in Ireland, or he was raised in an Irish Catholic sort of, at the time, a ghetto, in terms of economics, right? A poor neighborhood in Garrison Beach, South Brooklyn. When I'm from New York as well, right? Born and raised in New York. And so when I got the book deal, I kind of made this a magical book in just how it just everything worked. I didn't even make it so it just became that, but in terms of I paid homage. I went to Garrison Beach, a few times, but the night that I got the deal, I drove to Garrison Beach, which is in the most southern region area of South Brooklyn. It's still extremely remote today, 90 years after, 92 years after Bob's birth. So
still amazing, like your description of it, when his father didn't have work, that they would be living off vegetables that they're raising. Like, you think people living like that in anywhere in Brooklyn is like, oh my God, it's because on the one hand, 93 years is a long time, but also it isn't. And to just, I was sitting with the I don't know Brooklyn that well, but I know it a bit. And I'm like, oh my God, like to just, this is a random segue, but it'll make sense. Like my friends bought me Dolly Parton tickets for my birthday when I was still in London. And she tells the story she grew up with, like the house she grew up in did not have running water or electricity. It had an outhouse. And it's like, what? That's
yeah,
that's wild. Anyway, I also have to point out that my site has been stuck at 23% uploaded for the last 5 minutes. And I am going to ask you about some 23 syncs that happened over the course of your research. But carry on. You went to Bob's birthplace and his childhood home when you got the book deal. Pick it up from there.
I did, yeah. And I wasn't quite able to find his childhood home. I couldn't find any records of where that was. But I got to see, I just felt it. Writing this book was a great education in humanities, right? And Bob really provides a real great curriculum of humanities if you really read everything that he's writing. And I mean that in the sense of, learning about living, breathing people. And we can discuss ideas all day, and there's a certain objectivity that we like to say that we hold when we're doing that. But to really get into the visceral aspect of what this existence is about, it's us meat puppets that are moving around in this world, and And like, so I just wanted to get as close as possible to that experience while providing like a micro history. Like, so, you know, I wanted to discuss Bob and his ideas, but I love, you know, Howard Zinn's book, The People's History of the United States, and the whole notion, of course, of people's history, which Bob is a part of. You know, he's was outside the mainstream, but he was still a significant, important voice during that time. He's part of this lineage of people's history of America and the world, right? He's a voice. And I think that he wrote like that too. He never really announced it. He's even though he's always playing with the facts of history, he's extremely historically literate. And I think out of subjects, I'm very taken by history. I love history, and Illuminatus trilogy also sparked extreme interest in me. I read it right before entering college, as I said before, and I just wanted to learn as much as I could about the names and the dates that was being discussed in that book. And I think he just is able to do that in his work. He turns an engine and really makes you want to do it. And he's a great teacher in that respect, you know, and to be able to communicate that through his words and his books, I think that's the value that he still holds, you know. I think that can be applied to our current cultural landscape, that sort of method. And I think that's what I was trying to do in my book as well, was to write like Bob in a way, but really, but just let his influence on my style be. But I'm confident enough in my own writing style for it to be different as well, you know? Yeah.
So, all right, you get the book deal, you go to the area or the place where he grew up, and presumably by then, because as you said, you've been making notes for at that stage almost a decade and a half, right? So do you look at it and go, okay, I've got a spine of his life. Here's where he was born. We know where he died. There are chunks of life. There's there's the island, there's San Francisco, there's all these bits. And you're like, okay, I need to flesh it out. Like, how does that work? Or who do you then go like, who's still alive that I can talk to? How does that process work? Because you're like, all right, let's do this.
Yeah, for sure. I received great help from Doug Rushkoff.
That's sweet.
Yeah, at the very beginning, he put me in touch with the executor of Bob's estate, his daughter Christina, and that was great. That really started it, because I started interviewing Christina about once a week, a couple times a week, sometimes, for a little over a year. It was great. She just like, you know, told me the history from her eyes, right? And so the real starting point, though, was the text, and I would always bring things back to the text. Bob provides a very good framework in his Cosmic Trigger series of his own biography. So I would just need to fact check as much of those things that he wrote about as possible, of which, you know, which I did. And yeah, so I kept returning to the text, but yes, the interviews, maybe that's when it started feeling like, yes, I'm a biographer. You know, and I would send the emails out to like these very smart people, and I'm like, hey, I'm this guy. And they'd be like, yeah, of course. And I'm like, oh, I am this guy, you know? Yeah. And yeah, so many people who were friends with Bob, like the closer you got to people who knew Bob, like the cooler the people were, really. And they had a lot of time for me. As I said, Saul Paul Sarag was like, I have a ton of interview notes with Saul Paul. He like tutored me in like quantum physics for about a year, which that's amazing, right? To receive sort of tutoring from a particle physicist, right? And a number of interviews stuff did not make it in the book. There's a lot. I interviewed, I think, around 50 people, kind of like concentric circles out from, I tried to get as close as possible, you know, I was able to speak to all of Bob's living children, even Graham, which was really special. Also, Alex was really great to speak with. And then Bob's friends who were still around, and so I got to speak with Paul Krasner before he passed away, which was great. And that guy was fantastic, a really fun spirit. I played him some hip hop music, some underground hip hop music, he was cool. And then also Antoro Ali, who very good writer, and recently passed away, and he had some great stories about Bob, so I was able to get that in the book. And so that was going on. The interviews were happening while then I started doing the special collections research quest. That also started with the help of Rushkoff. A gentleman at the New York Public Library sent him an email. I don't know about what, but Doug was like, oh, it was about the Timothy Leary papers that had just arrived at the New York Public Library, and they were being sorted. And so that guy was like, hey, Doug, check this out. And Doug was like, he put me in touch with the guy. He's like, yo, they have stuff on Robert Anton Wilson there, maybe, right? And they did, because Tim Leary's archivist was Michael Horowitz. And he was also kind of Bob's archivist, unofficial archivist for a few years during the 70s. And they also had the manuscript for Leary's The Game of Life there.
Oh, really?
Which, Bob contributed to greatly. And Bob actually really was like the editor of that book. Like, I got to see the pages, and the liner notes is all mostly Bob's handwriting, and making some great suggestions, etc. And that was a treasure trove. Going into the New York Public Library, for those who don't know, if you don't know, that's the library where they filmed Ghostbusters. So that's where like Slimer was. And I loved that movie as a kid. So anyway, I got to go there, and that really, I was like, oh shoot, I need to do this. It was kind of like a spontaneous, but I knew I had to do that anyway, just from reading other biographies, like access the subject's correspondence, that's what the next stage was. And Wilson does not yet have a special collections dedicated to him at any library. I'm not sure if one library has recently popped up, maybe collecting some of his stuff. That might be the case, but for the time of writing the book, so for instance, at the New York Public Library, there's the William Burroughs papers, there's the Timothy Leary papers. Their authors have their papers. Bob has not received that yet, right? So a cool find in that was, there was a lot of cool finds, but there were so many discoveries that I made while writing this book, Gordon, about Bob. That was, oh man, I didn't know that. Like, well, I didn't know that.
That's totally one of my questions. Like, how has your perspective of him changed? Like, what are the things that you found out? Like from Sirag or someone, like, oh, Bob's favorite food was almonds. Like, do you know what, like weird, like, oh, I didn't know that he liked to do this or whatever. Like, that's so cool. Yeah.
Yeah, man. I think a lot of those discoveries were in his earlier years, like the beginning of his career, the early 60s into the 60s. Maybe when he was living in New York City, North Jersey, New York City in the mid 60s, before he got the job with Playboy. There was a little short window of time because the Wilsons had moved to Ohio for a few years, where Bob went to the School of Living, which was like it's not quite an anarchist learning institute, but the American anarchists are part of the curriculum, if you will. And Bob took that knowledge back to New York, and he plugged that into his work at the Realist magazine, which was Paul Krasner's cutting edge underground newspaper at the time. And during that time, though, Bob was meeting and hanging out with William Burroughs. He became friends with, I'm not sure how close they were friends, but with Ed Sanders and Tilly Kupferberg, who those two guys, Ed Sanders and Tilly, they were beat poets, but they later formed a group called the Fugs, which is, considered like the proto punk rock band. They have the song CIA Man, which is a very fun song to listen to. And also go F yourself with the atomic bomb or something like that. That was totally cooked for Berg. So discovering Bob as like a hip jazz club going, weed smoking, peyote
Oh my
eating,
God. Yeah.
you know.
Yeah.
And
Like Ned Flanders' parents. Like, okay, yeah, I see it. It's interesting, that era of time, right, where one of the things I learned from your book as well was that it's not that he was poor, it's that he and Arlen were really shit with money. Like, I just think about if I got an inheritance, it's like, oh, let's buy a mansion in Jersey. It's like, how about you don't?
Yeah.
How about you actually? And then what do you know? A few years later, oh, we have no money. We have to sell the mansion. It's like, I have a suggestion. Don't buy a mansion. And you think, okay, this actually explains a lot, because there were times in his life where he was poor and times when he wasn't. I'm like, what's going on here? And your book helped me with, oh, they're actually, they're not very good with money. And it's fine. It's not like people have different skills, but that really opened it up for me. It's like, what? Because you get that is, when we were living in a mansion in New Jersey, I'm like, what are you, squatting? Like, what happened there? I'm like, okay, right. Now I see it. Now I see a bit more of how a life like that develops, because I'm always actually interested in how a creative life is resourced. And he seemed to have lived every kind of creative life, from essentially homeless to mansion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he got the full range, man, which for an artist, isn't that the palette that,
Exactly.
I mean, yeah.
Exactly. So, all right, you found out all these things about him. How do you describe Robert Anton Wilson? Like, now that you've written this book, it's like, oh, I wrote a book. It's a biography of this guy called Robert Anton Wilson. If someone says, who is that? How do you describe him to people?
Oof. Yeah, Bob was an early underground newspaper, journalist who, co-wrote a pioneering underground novel. That alone I think is interesting, right? He's a satirical novelist of greatly underappreciated, but in the same milieu, if you will, as Pynchon, right? As Thomas Pynchon, who is so intellectually discussed, right? Bob is emergent of a future form of no brow art, where low brow and high brow is nearly completely eradicated, and the walls came tumbling in, and this new weird form of living art gets created. So essentially, Bob is just a really interesting writer, right? Someone, if you're into William S. Burroughs, you should read Robert Anton Wilson.
Yeah, I describe him as he was one of the cornerstones of the late 20th century American counterculture. So like an underground intellectual. But that's how, when I hand the book to people, I say, it's all good in the same breath of like a John Cassavetes film. It's still a masterpiece. It's a bit dated. Like, you need to know him like you need to know Burroughs. It's that same,
sure.
It's that same idea of like, here is one of the cornerstones of the 20th century American counterculture. And that's why he deserves his own biography. So well done.
Thank you. Yes, 100%. He is a cornerstone for sure.
So what would you say? Because I've been thinking about this. Oh, I'll ask you. I want to ask the 23 question first, but I'll tell you everyone has one. In high school, when I'm handing this book out to like get friends and impress people, one guy, and he was Irish as well. He was reading my copy of Cosmic Trigger, and we're in I guess you would say a diner, but we would call it something different in Australia. And we're talking about the 23 Enigma and what actually is that, or if you had any of them. And I pulled my ticket because we were in the queue to be served, and it was of course 23 while we were talking about it. And this is his book, and that's the one that sticks in my head of like the infinite loop of getting 23s when you start talking about Robert Anton Wilson and the 23 Enigma. But did you have your eyes peeled for any 23s over the course of the project, and did any good ones stand out?
Oh, oosh. 23, yeah. I mean, it's kind of like once that seal is broken, you kind of like 23 is kind of part of it from then on, right? An increase in 23 synchronicities. I mean, I see it all the time. I like barely even pay attention to it now. but it's so many places. And what I write in the book, Life and Thought Crimes of Robert Anton Wilson, is that Bob's, sort of what we learned, or what I learned, is that Burroughs may not have met a man named Captain Clark at all in Tangiers. Burroughs was doing a lot of heroin in Tangiers. Not saying that he, who knows where that story came from, but thinking about the likelihood of all that story, that is a very spooky story. The story of Captain Clark, the steamboat engine driver for 23 years in Tangiers, right? It was one of the co-editors of 14 magazine, who, a very, kind of esteemed literary magazine exploring supernatural events and whatnot, who Bob wrote for a little bit in the 1980s. He said that it's a shame that Burroughs story was not true. Right? Yeah. And but the interesting thing is, like, where does 23 come from? This notion, because Jack Kirby wrote a really fun comic strip around this sort of cursed area of the 23 Enigma, where the protagonist gets lucky with the number 23, while at a casino, and then he wants to keep running his luck, and he's on a plane and it crashes, which coincides with this dark aura around the 23 Enigma, at least as Burroughs describes it to Wilson. Burroughs said that after he met Captain Clark and he was listening to the radio and Clark died and whatnot, he started keeping a scrapbook of 23 synchronicities that he was happening, and it was all very dark, right? One can say that Wilson's path during that time and his encountering of these 23s, it wasn't all fun and games either, and especially some of the things that he was seeing, that the death of Dutch Schultz and the Mad Dog, Vincent Kelly, or Cole, Mad Dog Cole, who shot him, all on the October 23rd. Like, this is dark material around this Enigma. So saying that, I found there were nothing offhand, but just from news items, that the hundreds of news items that we get every day now through various streams on the internet, my mind, when I hear 23 sort of thing, like, 23 people died, I'd be like, oh, there it is, 23, right? But
but you didn't like sign the contract on the 23rd or anything, like, very obviously, like, here's the book and bam. And are there any Easter eggs on page 23 we should know about?
Well, I'm not sure about page 23, but there is a secret in the book. There's a secret message, and I didn't do this on purpose. It's there, though. And it is in the Chapel Perilous chapter, and it's in the footnotes section. So I'll leave that for readers to look for.
Very, very good. All right.
And there were synchronicities that happened for sure during the writing of the book, some of which were spooky, some were really great. But those synchronicities definitely, made me feel, again, this resonance with this process of writing this book about Bob, of how important it felt to relate the story of Wilson, but not just Wilson, but just what is it like telling a biography of a person living on this earth, and that's the education in humanities for me. Like, is it like, what's it like in another person's shoes?
I like that you had so William James has that concept of the library angel, which is that the cosmos will deliver exactly the right book in a very unusual way to you. For people who I've interviewed who've written biographies, particularly biographies of people who've had a little soupçon of magic in their life, it is a bit spookier. It's like, Bob, are you helping me write this book? Like, what's going on? Was there anything like, oh yeah, I was up at night And I was looking for a thing, and I just yelled into the sky, like, I need to find the exact date of blah, blah, blah. And then I got an email. Like, is there any of that kind of like weird things that you can recall off the top of your head?
There are, yeah. Well, yeah, the first one, and I guess it's the one I talk about the most. And there was a few things that happened, and I want to give you some of that too. But this is the spookiest, I'd say. I was spontaneously researching, Wilson had a 15-year-old daughter named Luna who was brutally beaten and tragically murdered while she was working at an after-school job, which was only blocks away from where the Wilsons were living while they were living in Berkeley in October 1976. And it's a really sad part of the book. And it was hard writing that, but going into the research about, Bob never really talked much about this person. It's completely makes sense. I know why. And even the Wilson family didn't know much about this guy, but I got a name of the guy from Christina. And then I did a little bit of research on him, and then I put that to the side for a while. And I got an itch one night. I got paid from work, and I was like, oh, I'm going to try one of these peoplefinder.com websites to search public records on this guy, right? Who was this guy? I found out that he'd already died. And then, so I did that. And like I said, I got the urge to do this. A lot of the writing of this book, it wasn't these different areas that I did. There was a structure, like the skeleton of a building, but like in terms of framing and putting up the drywall, I was doing some work on the 8th floor, then going back to the 1st floor. I was, like putting in an HVAC system on the roof, and then I was going down to the basement, sort of writing sort of thing, right? And so even letting that up to chance, if you will. And so it was one day in June, I think, and I was like, okay, I'm going to do this. And I just got the urge that day to write about this guy and to look him up on the peoplefinder.com. And I did that. And then I found out all this stuff about him. And then about 2 weeks later, I realized like, oh, whoa, I did that on the night that was his birthday.
Yeah.
And I found out too, like, when he went to jail, he joined he got admitted into a fire conservation program, which in California, they're basically trained in firefighting to fight large, huge, mega forest fires. They're called in to help firefighters, like the huge firefights. And so in exchange for that, they would maybe get a reduced sentence. And this guy got out after 5 years, which I thought was really, really strange. But I spoke with a private investigator who told me that that maybe not have been that unusual in the 70s, different sentencing terms and whatnot. And that guy lived for a few more years. He had some family, and then he passed away. So that happened. That was pretty crazy. More Bob related synchronicities. I mean, there was quite a number. I mean, I spoke about this too. Bob wrote, he obviously explored the notion of UFOs, right? It wasn't a major part of his work, but he did write a fair amount about it. And I found out in my research, I put it in the book. He never put it in Cosmic Trigger or anything like that. He put it in a article, I think it was called In My Own Way, right? That he first saw a UFO when he was around 15 with his family on the porch in Brooklyn. And his parents told him, like, don't ever talk about this. And he looked in the local newspaper for weeks, the Brooklyn Eagle, afterwards to find news reports, and nothing was there. So that was a lesson for him in, I guess, what's now called the science of, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, agnotology, the science of studying the things that we are willfully unaware of. Bob was a great researcher of that, right? And so when I started writing this book, I just UFOs all the time, like seeing UFOs, basically flying lights in the sky. They could have been satellites, who knows? but one huge one in October, very close to Halloween. My girlfriend and I were driving, leaving Target, and on the left-hand side of the car was a, orange glowing, flying orb just above the tree line, and as soon as I pulled my camera out to film it, it disappeared. And there was just something strange about the feeling of it, right? And I researched that, the orange glowing orb, and there's a lot of literature about that, a lot of sightings. And I saw stuff on YouTube of people filming the exact thing that I saw. And in my interviews, I interviewed Christina. And when I interviewed Christina, she told me about when she was a child and they were staying in Yellow Springs, she saw an orange glowing orb floating in the trees in Yellow Springs, and then just went away. And I thought that was super interesting. But what is interesting too, I'd never done more night viewing than ever before during the writing of the book. So maybe those, I must say too, I haven't seen many orange glowing orbs floating. It was mostly like white lights moving extremely fast in the sky. But I haven't looked up at the sky in a while, so I haven't seen them.
Yeah, there you go. It's interesting, right? Because Jacques Vallée similarly didn't really talk about seeing a UFO as a kid until he published his journals like Forbidden Science and so on. And it fits under that assumption that experiences have touched lives. So Robert Anton Wilson, when I find out in your book, of course he saw a UFO as a kid, because generally speaking, people who have lives like Robert Anton Wilson see UFOs as kids. Like it's just sort of you would say touched by fairy or something. Like there's that hint of magic about him that leads people to have lives like that. What do you think? So we've sort of spoken about why we would read him today, but I want to come back to that idea about what some stuff is dated, some stuff isn't. But so we'll talk about that. But then also, what are people going to be reading of Robert Anton Wilson in 2124? Like, does Robert Anton Wilson last another 100 years?
That's a great question. What I think, yeah, I do. I think that Illuminatus, I think that all of his fiction work will remain.
Yeah.
Because that's the great thing about Bob, is that, what an interesting nonfiction writer, and, new journalism. He was like a new journalist in the spirit and lineage of Thomas Wolfe and Norman Mailer and Hunter S. Thompson, where with the Cosmic Trigger series, especially Cosmic Trigger Volume 1, I think that's going to be read for a long time. I think that should be considered like a Penguin classic. Again, barring the dated information, but what is interesting about that book is the way that he's putting all this information together and presenting it. Yeah. His method of dispersal within that book is, I think, valuable, right?
You had me at the fiction. Like, if people are going to be reading Naked Lunch in 2124, and they absolutely are, then they'll be reading Illuminatus. Like, that's solved it, at least at that. I think you're right. I think Cosmic Trigger 1 should be a Penguin classic of new journalism. But people will read Illuminatus because it's not at all like Naked Lunch, except that it is, in that it's part of that countercultural lineage at that particular 20-ish year span. So that solved it for me. I wasn't sure what I mean. If you assume, which is not how these things work, but if you assume 100% accuracy of Cosmic Trigger 1 at the time of publication and have it decline through the years, scientific accuracy, right? Like, so the stuff that he's talking about, it's probably about 40%. So if you think going 100 years, potentially not. But Illuminatus is still at 100% today, and it will be in 2124. I like that. I think people will be reading his fiction in a century. That's excellent.
For sure. I mean, Jesse Walker, author of a very interesting book, was it The United States of Paranoia, a little history of conspiracy theory within the United States, has said that, more people have heard of Gravity's Rainbow, but more people have read Illuminatus you know, because Illuminatus is just this word of mouth sort of engine that I learned about it in the back of math class. Like booksellers on the corner in New York City would sell the book. It's a living document, right? It's of the James Joyce school,
Yes.
you know, like
Yeah.
Wilson that was his Ulysses, you know, that was his and Shay's Ulysses right there. And that's why it will last as a form of, you know, in the area of literature, right? Of course, literature, but you know, that kind of you know, celebration of lowbrow in a way, that elevation of pulp, you know, in terms of telling the story, which makes it sort of like a transmedia document, right? It's already sort of, it reads like you're channel surfing Illuminatus, right? So so there's so many techniques that are used within that novel that I think is worthy of much study, like in colleges and whatnot, right? English classes. But back on Cosmic Trigger, why I think it is important is well, I think because it's a document of that time, like, and that place, like the spirit of which it's written from, like the underground media of the counterculture, you know, especially today, is nearly forgotten. And you know, we're in this whole new era of you know, a media sphere. It's a new world, literally. And so, you know, just as sort of like a historical document too. I mean, you're speaking to a biased like reporter here. I think I love most of his books. But yeah, I mean, but what has the value to remain? Again, I think everything is under control. I mean, I don't know what will people even be reading books in 2194 or whatnot.
They'll
You
be
know,
reading fiction
but
in some way, shape, or form. That's for sure. Like everything under control. I remember getting a big New Falcon version of that in my teenagers. It was New Falcon actually, but like, and I'm reading through it, and this is not so much pre-internet, but the internet was rubbish because it was only a couple of years old. And you know, you get to the Bilderbergers page, and it's like Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands every year arranges for heads of state and the CEOs to come, and they have a secret meeting that journalists around the world are banned from. And I'm like, that's not true.
right,
Except it is. What
right,
the hell? The power of everything is under control is that it's like Alex Jones. I mean, actually, he was before the internet as well. But I mean, like, that's not correct. But it is. And you go, oh, that one, Propaganda Due, that didn't happen either. Yes, it did. And you're like, what
right.
the fuck is going on in this fucking planet? And it is its own, funnily enough, Operation Mindfuck. So I'm not as, I think reality has changed so much that the impact of that book is lessened a bit because you can, I'm not making it the same as InfoWars, but like you can actually, with some skills on the internet, go, okay, well, what are the Bilderbergers then? Oh shit, it is a real thing. And then on to the next one. But it was
100%. Oh yeah,
this weird document of like, oh my God, is this, what the fuck? Yeah.
yeah. No, I agree. I should revise that as well. Maybe like the introduction of everything is under control, I find to be really important because it's there where Bob says that most conspiracy theories, if not all conspiracy theories, rely on what, you know, the is of identity, you know, which is a term from general semantics, which, you know, basically, when we say someone or something is, you know, such and such a person is mean, right? We're applying like a static, absolute sort of viewpoint of that person, that they're always mean or whatnot, right? We're trapped by the language that we use in terms of our perspective and our perception of seeing how varied, you know, life is. It's, you know, when we use the is of identity, we're completely reducing, you know, people to a point of view that, according to Bob, doesn't even exist, right? So, these conspiracy theories, if you read these conspiracy theories looking for every time they rely on the is of identity. So the world is ruled by shape-shifting reptilian aliens from the fourth or fifth dimension who have a prison planet around us, you know, going to utilize AI satellites and, you know, 5G, you know, whatever, to form this prison planet force field, right? there was a couple is of identities in there, right? And the value of everything is under control, like what value of most of Wilson's work when he discusses conspiracy theories, and it's in Illuminatus trilogy, is the fact that it's hyper contextual. He's purposely putting like conspiracy theories that don't agree with each other in everything is under control. So thereby forcing the reader to take in the information critically, because in a sense he probably knew, well, Everything is Under Control was put out by HarperCollins, which was a major publisher. So it was in libraries and whatnot, but he might have known where he was being put in like Tower Records, not in the philosophy section. He might have been put amongst some conspiracy theorists, but if you read a regular conspiracy theorist book, and then you read, say, a Bob book or Everything's Under Control, you could see perhaps that even though that person is saying, hey, you got to think for yourself, they are maybe asking you to implicitly completely agree with their viewpoint.
Yes.
That maybe the world is ruled by shape-shifting reptilian aliens. There's no other alternative to that. Bob is saying maybe this, maybe that, maybe this. And ultimately he's presenting like, really a study of phenomenology. I think Bob is a great phenomenologist, if you will, meaning that, without falling into solipsism, we can't really speak beyond what we are, our five senses. But then that's where we rely on science and, trying to keep as accurate a record as possible. And these maps that we present to other people, which, is supposed to be as accurate a description as possible, because if we can do that for each other, we all gain intelligence. We all get smarter. Society functions at a sort of better level, if you will. So that's where Bob was coming from with all of his arguments, I think, around conspiracy theory. He used them as sort of like case studies to test your critical thinking skills.
Yes. And like I sometimes call that conspiracy yoga. So I had Richard Metzger on the show recently, a couple of months ago now. And obviously he founded Disinfo, famously, right? So, and after we'd finished recording, we had a chat about conspiracies and so on. And he's like, basically we both agreed that conspiracies are dangerous is the wrong word, over. There's no, because of what you just said, the people who say do your own research are essentially providing you a binary, which is that you comply with official reality's version of events, or you do your own research and believe me. And the me might also be wrong. So it's like, do your own research, the implication being like, so you can either believe MSNBC or me, this guy on the internet who thinks Trump is a time traveler who's fighting global pedophiles. Bob would not fuck with that. And it's because of all these reasons you said there, that they are invitations to, and I can appreciate, especially as the world is, from a political perspective, getting worse as the West ends in it, because that's just what happens, fourth turning, blah, 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 right? I can appreciate the frustration of people going like, yes, but we are like literally living in an age where things that are conspiracies are actually happening. At the time of recording, the outgoing president has pardoned his son for his many crimes. That's somewhere in between corruption and conspiracy. But Bob's point is like, well, like, I guess for me, I would say my understanding of Bob would be like, sit with the tension and frustration of that, but don't let that narrative tip you into the belief that there's only two. There's the like, oh, well, I don't agree with that, or I do. Like, that's not the actual binary. Bob was like, well, open it up. Conspiracy yoga, so that it's, you can, sit with the discomfort or uncomfort, which is where I'm going with this towards Chapel Perilous. It's not supposed to be comfortable to be in the unfamiliar, to like, familiar is comfortable, but probably wrong. Like someone's probably lying to you at that point. And Bob was very good and very patient with that process that can be frustrating and irritating. Like, yes, but bad things are happening. They absolutely are, right? Like that's a reason to be better at this, not worse at it.
I like that. Yeah, I love that term, conspiracy yoga. I think that's a very apt description for what he was seeking to do, especially say with Everything is Under Control. But, also Illuminatus, by presenting, again, conflicting sort of descriptions of a historical event, or, who were the Illuminati, right? That's what he unpacks a lot in that book, and then Cosmic Trigger, right? And how he follows that through the rest of his career, he realizes he can utilize conspiracy theory, just like Philip K. Dick utilizes, alien invasion as a trope within his fiction to, make the reader feel unsettled. It's just very good writing. Bob uses conspiracy theory and paranoia to drive people to really let them feel the book, something more than just words on a page, especially today, how important it is. People struggle with reading articles online at this point. Forget about reading a book, but the Illuminatus is like a grimoire. It's like a living text, Yeah. And so I think that his writing alone engages the reader, but approaching conspiracies, I think that he was pretty clear. I think a nice way to contextualize him would be to speak about sort of like Noam Chomsky versus Michael Parenti, right? They're two perspectives, both political scientists, and Noam Chomsky, is into what he calls structural analysis, I believe, of events, right? It's not personal. It's not a group of people that are specifically doing something, it's the structure that has evolved over hundreds of years, which for Chomsky is this, hyper-capitalistic, system that we've created of, exploitation and accumulation through dispossession and propaganda, right? And then Michael Parenti actually gives an argument for, no, you should be a little conspiracy-minded at times, because at times there literally were conspiracies, like Propaganda Due, as I talk about in the book, which was an Italian, it was a conspiracy that happened in Italy and other countries, but it was a secret society that came about, that was formed out of the Freemasons at the time, and the ringleaders of that secret society, picked the high-ranking Freemasons and utilized them to try to bring in a fascist state within Italy, a Nazi fascist state as well, and so that's pretty shocking, and that story broke in 1982 when the man they call God's banker, Roberto Calvi, was found hanging under Friars Bridge in London.
Friars Bridge, yes. I used to drink at a pub where I could watch where he could, on the Thames, you could look and go, that's where he was hanging, and we would, anyway.
Oh man, that's wild.
Yes, little bits of fanboy parts of it. But
Bob did that though. Bob was able to unpack that in ways that really, I think, made people want to unpack it themselves, and then also critically look at his work. I've critically analyzed much of what Bob has said and things that he thought about, and I still think there's a lot of value even in his approach to conspiracy theory. And would he be I think he would show no fear. I think that he would be hip to the QAnon stuff. I think that he would discuss it. About QAnon, which is interesting, is that the way that they gave their messages or communiques, like through these questions and whatnot, that's straight out of, that's how Bob did it. He did that in Maybe Logic Academy. I think that someone behind the QAnon was in one of those Maybe Logic classes, and
well, yes. That's pretty obvious. Speaking of conspiracies that are probably true, that one's an intelligence agency for whatever. I don't know what they're fucking doing, right? But this is a really good example, because I think people push back on Bob's refusal to land on a tape as, we can look at something, Biden pardoning Hunter. It's yes, but that actually happened. That's not the thing that Bob's refusing. Bob's refusing you don't know what's going to happen. Everything is under control. It's all the Propaganda Due stuff that happened. There were Operation Gladio. Poor Italy. Just once could someone just let them develop a fucking government? But anyway, so Operation Gladio is the leave behind networks to make sure at the end of World War II that no left-wing governments on the right-hand side of the Iron Curtain could develop. So they would be collapsed or assassinated. And this was a US NATO plot. This is history. It's not, but it's not it's not so much you don't know who's in charge, although that is also true. It's that these things are all happening, but you don't know what's going to happen. Like that, you onboard this information not so that you don't subscribe to a narrative, not so that you do subscribe to a different one. And that's the bit that I think people miss with Bob, because it can be irritating. I find some of his JFK writing irritating because the things that I don't like, just personally, not because it's bad writing, I don't care as much about James Joyce as he does. No one cares as much about James Joyce as he did. But I also don't care about the mafia. I'm just disinterested, right? And so in his kind of hoiling through JFK and so on, he focuses more on the mafia side of things, which I don't care about, right? And so I bounce off it going like, yes, but Bob, look at what happened with after JFK with the vice president. Look at what happened with look at what happened with the wars, and he's just like jonesing on this mafia stuff. And so it works for me. This is conspiracy yoga. Like I get irritated by the fact that he's focusing on stuff that I don't think is actually macro relevant to the JFK story. But like, good, it's supposed to irritate me because otherwise I might think that I'm right.
For sure.
And I'm not.
100%. Yeah. I mean, like, again, I like that term, conspiracy yoga, because I mean, he was doing this, that book came out in 1998. So this is like 8 years before, 9 years before the iPhone, for Telegram, before how people get all this information now, like on their phones. Right. And, so that book was a resource. That book was like a little internet in and of itself, of finding all these weird recondite sort of conspiracies and an introduction to these things. Like in that book too, you're speaking of Operation Gladio, which blew my mind when I first learned about that. And it was in that book. And I didn't really put that in my biography. I spoke about Propaganda Due. I wanted to put Gladio in because they are related. But then, Bob, I think he presents, this term has gotten, it's a bad rap in the last 8 years, but the term deep state, right? Really that term comes from my knowledge of it, Peter Dale Scott, the political historian, right? Who wrote a book about JFK called Parapolitics and the Deep State, I think. No, he didn't say deep state, but he coined the term deep politics, right? And basically deep politics are the things that go on really beyond the eyes of the average person. And propaganda is the communication device dispersed through newspapers. I mean, that's an historical fact, right? Like, so there's plenty of deep politics that has always gone on. And in America, well, in other places too, I think this is where Bob's interest in the mafia arises, is the role that the mafia played in the 20th century in the deep political sphere and whatnot. But no, I totally get it though, because I laughed before because he said James Joyce and the mafia, two things that you're not interested in. Like, those are two things I love about Bob.
Yeah. Well, see, but that's good. Like, because when you first got in contact about the book, I'm like, oh God, am I going to have to read about James Joyce and the fucking mafia? And thank God, like, I understand his James Joyce. Like, I knew why. We're all diaspora. Everyone on this call is the diaspora from wherever, and I get what it's like to grow up, with that yearning for motherland culture stuff, right? So I absolutely understand what that was for him from a journey perspective, like the James Joyce stuff. My point is, you did it well, and I wasn't bored. So,
Nice.
but that's because you like it. If I'd written this book, James Joyce would have made it in under protests, but in the interest of diligence, his love of James Joyce would have obviously made it in there. Lucky last question though, Gabriel. Chapel Perilous, was it always called that? And what does that term mean for you? Because I think it's one of the things that still has currency in Bob's thought.
Yeah, it did pretty much from the near beginning of the book. I was playing with the idea, the book title, Keep the Lasagna Flying.
Okay, yeah.
But that kind of hits different, is a slightly different tone.
So follow-up book, when you do or when you edit a collection of thinkers responding to Bob's thought, it can be called that.
Yeah, there you go. There you go.
There you go.
Having a little lasagna food fight.
Exactly.
You know?
Keeping the lasagna. Yeah, I like it. Anyway, carry on. Chapel Perilous.
Yeah. So Life and Thought Crimes of Robert Anton Wilson. I mean, I think that it aptly describes what he was about. I mean, he explored the realm of Chapel Perilous. Chapel Perilous, and the literary origins, it's a medieval poem around, a place you find yourself in when you're on a journey, a sacred journey, to find an elixir of great importance, whatever that may be for you, right? But as it's described in the book, it's far deeper than that. Like Joseph Campbell's description of the what's being sought on that mission that one finds themselves in the Chapel of Perilous is, the like in the Indiana Jones movie, like the sacred, cup, right, of which to drink from, a cup that is made by angels, that is beyond good and evil, like that is to help us remember, to stay in touch with, our true natures, if you will, right? And I think that was Bob's whole thing, his interest in magic. Christina said it, but it was pretty clear in his work, and he said it in letters. His interest was transcendence, right? His interest was elevating. That's in all of his work, even his nonfiction. What I like about when Bob discusses energy, his discussion of Buckminster Fuller and the idea of where do ideas come from for new technologies, like how it comes from our minds first, right? Like, so that's magic, the idea of like creating the idea, getting the vision, right? To innovate and create a new invention that will help people. I think that's in Bob's work, and one must journey through a Chapel Perilous continually. Another metaphor, I guess, is a dark night of one's soul, right? Dark night of the soul. But Chapel Perilous feels a little bit more active. One must enter and one must leave. One must face whatever is there. And within the stories, like the Thomas Mallory poem about it, and the other Arthurian tales about, King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, and them interacting with Chapel Perilous, there's one's brother is injured, and one must enter the chapel to get his a piece of cloth that'll heal your fellow man, right? Like this journey of taking the story of taking a journey and putting oneself at risk for the greater good of humanity. I think Bob was all about that. I think he was a romantic. Him and Arlen were romantics. That's one reason you could say they were so bad with money, right? Like, of course, they were also traumatized children, right? And they're of a generation where they're not as therapized, they're not as therapeutic, not as psychoanalytic as we are today. They're the pioneering generation of people going to therapy and figuring things out, right? So they're first generation sort of health conscious in that regard, and they're pioneers in that regard.
I think Bob Wilson could have done better with his health, and I think some of that is subtextually there in the book. I don't think that was much of a priority for him, that or money. Like they didn't live right. Do you know what I mean? From the way we do today. Yeah,
100%. I mean, Arlen could have eaten better too. Stories of after she had like heart surgery, Alex telling me that, she was still eating rich foods and always trying to, when Alex would turn her back, she was pouring salt on the steak and whatnot. Yeah, they had their attachments in the older world, but geez, man, when I think about the environments that they grew up in, like,
totally.
Arlen, pretty wild stuff. But, Chapel Perilous is, I think, yes, a very apt metaphor for where we are today and where we've been for quite a while now in the world, but especially today. We are in collectively, one could say, a Chapel Perilous, and I hope that we could get out.
We'll get out one way or the other. I like to paraphrase Tina Turner, we can do this nice or rough, but I like Chapel Perilous' title and almost like as a summation of Bob's life, because something like Dark Night of the Soul has a foregone conclusion. The implication is that the sun will rise. The Chapel Perilous keeps you, which is very Bob, but it keeps you in that state, and it also doesn't provide a happy ending or a approval. Because what I like about your book is it's obviously someone who has a deep love for the thought and work of Robert Anton Wilson, who's been enriched in his life with it. But it's not a hagiography. Like you actually do see not the totality. We can't really do that, but you get a nice rounded picture and an honest and fair picture of someone. And when you look at his life, you go, he was a counterculture intellectual and a brilliant one who, like all of us, except for you and I, Gabriel, had some flaws.
100%.
And there's something about Chapel Perilous that's like, Bob went in. Bob, he's to some extent still in there, but the Chapel Perilous is he chose to make a perilous quest. His life is that, and I think we're all the better for it.
For sure. Yeah. And that's one thing I hope that I was able to get across in the book, the value of just, walking with Bob through his life throughout the 20th century, seeing some of the things that he saw and, really learning some history, not just about him, but also about, America and the West in general.
Yeah. Well, so you did a good job. Well done. And thank you so much for your time. Let people know if they want to know more about yourself or the book or whatever, where they can go and so on and so forth.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. The book is available on my website. It's chapelperilous.us. It's right there. It's also available on Amazon. So just Chapel Perilous, Gabriel Kennedy at Amazon. But I would recommend going to the website, checking it out there. And for now, that's it. It's just got, it's going to be translated into Spanish. So that was cool to hear. I just, signed a deal with a publisher for that. And then hopefully maybe a couple other languages too in the near future. But for now, chapelperilous.us is the best place.
Awesome. All right. Well, once again, congratulations and thank you very much.
Thank you, Gordon.